There's an old riddle. You've probably heard it before. You're in a room and there are two doors. One door leads to freedom. The other door leads to death. At each door there is a guard, and you can ask one question. However, one guard always lies, the other guard always tells the truth, and you don't know which is which. If you don't already know the answer to the riddle, it's quite the conundrum, right? Because if you ask something straightforward like, which door leads to freedom, the truth teller will point to the door that leads to freedom, but the liar will point to the door that leads to death. How do you determine truth when you're not sure that the person you're speaking to will give it to you? On October 1st at 1 a.m., the news came by presidential tweet that the president and the first lady had tested positive for COVID-19. And for most of us, when we heard that news, our first question was, is this true? This is the state where we are as a country. Before we can get into the questions about what things mean and what are the consequences, we first feel that we have a personal responsibility just to try and figure out what is fact and what is fiction. As the story went on, things only became more confusing. On Saturday, 2 doctors came out and did a press conference and were very optimistic about the president's health, but they gave some details that didn't fit the timeline, talking about 72 hours from prognosis and 48 hours from the most recent treatment, and the numbers, the time just didn't fit. And so after those questions had been raised, then the doctors came back out again to apologize and say that they were wrong, that they had gotten confused, and they had given wrong information. This is the kind of thing that happens like in North Korea or in Russia. The big difference, at least as far as we know, is that these doctors are still alive. They haven't been publicly executed, nor have they fallen off a balcony. But the confusion didn't end there. At the end of that initial press conference, there had been a senior White House official who spoke to some reporters and seemed to negate everything that the doctors, that their optimism, he seemed to negate all of that and said that, that the previous 24 hours had been very important, very worrisome, and the next 48 hours were going to be critical. Reporters repeated that, as they do with anonymous sources, and then they got pushback. Then there were administration officials who were acting as if they, the reporters, were passing on incorrect information. And so then there had been enough people that had seen what was happened. The anonymous sourcing was dropped, and others stepped forward to say, actually, that senior White House official was Mark Meadows, the White House Chief of Staff. If you're in a room and there is one person who always lies and one person who always tells the truth, you're actually at an advantage over where we are now, because now sometimes someone will tell the truth, sometimes they will tell a lie, and you cannot know what is happening. For an administration that would want totalitarian rule, that confusion is a feature, not a flaw. Hannah Arendt, who literally wrote the book on totalitarianism, wrote that the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but the people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e. the standards of thought, no longer exist. This is where we are right now. This month, we are talking about the continuum of skepticism and trust, because both of these, skepticism and trust, are part of our Unitarian Universalist theological values. Living and writing at the same time as Arendt, British writer George Orwell had seen so many things in World War I and then in his experience during the Spanish Civil War that he decided in 1936 that he would pledge himself, he would pledge all of the writing that he would do from that point forward towards waging a war on totalitarianism. In perhaps his most well-known book, 1984, Orwell told the story of a country that had now descended into totalitarian rule that was so controlled that even your very thoughts were something that were studied by the government, that they would look at you through a screen looking for a certain little lift of your chin, or that you would be betrayed by a little shudder or a cringe. The last 3.5 years, 1984 has experienced a resurgence in popularity as people read it or reread it again. And several quotes have come out during these last few years. The one that I think that I have seen the most is, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." Now, I don't believe that we have our television spying on us, although for those of us who have things like Google Home or Alexa, we may wonder sometimes what it is picking up on. But this basic idea that you should be skeptical not of what you are hearing from the government, but that you should be skeptical of what you yourself see or hear. This is where we are now. And though the lengths and the methods that this administration will go in telling lies are apparently unprecedented, it didn't begin in 2016. This has been a part of the world forever. It has certainly been part of American history. Look back at the Nixon years, just to give one example. It is often said that the history books are written by the victors, which seems to be sort of a tacit acceptance that the history books that we read are not telling the full story. I do worry, though, that something has changed in the last 4 years. Something around the whole issue of the ethics of honesty itself. There seems now to be no shame in lies, no embarrassment for being caught in one. And I worry, what is this going to mean in the future? And apart from politics, what is this going to mean in our lives? What does this mean for the children that we are raising? What does this mean for our relationships? And the more I've read of Hannah Arendt's book on the origins of totalitarianism, the more I am convinced that this is something we should be worried about. Not just the lies that we hear, but the whole attitude around the lies, because she talks about that. She says the totalitarian mass leaders based their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that under such conditions, one could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism instead of deserting the leaders who had lied to them. They would protest that they had known all along that the statement was a lie and would admire the leaders for their superior tactical cleverness. It is not enough that we resist one particular political party or one political leader. As Unitarian Universalists, core to our religion is a sense of morality and ethical living. To live by a high ethical code means that we work to maintain a healthy skepticism about anything that we are hearing from the government, no matter who it is that is in the government. It means that we are more committed to facts and truth than we are to our own biases. If we are going to take Unitarian Universalism seriously, take it as having some tenets and some ethical clarity that we can use to help guide our own lives. It means that we have to look at those 7 principles and understand that when it talks about that principle, about a responsible search for truth and meaning, that we are the ones that have the responsibility to go out and find the facts, even if they don't fit with what we hope to be true. It means looking at those 6 sources that we draw from, and that one about the humanist teachings that warn us against the idolatries of the mind and the spirit, and that we ourselves are willing to change our minds when we find verifiable facts. The encouragement towards skepticism is a gift of Unitarian Universalism, but it comes with responsibility. When things just don't add up, when things just don't fit the timeline, we are called. It is a matter of duty for us to demand truth and demand factual answers. And when we are able to get them, it is our job to step forward and claim them and proclaim them that no, Oceania has not always been at war with East Asia. Stones are hard, water is wet, COVID-19 is not the same as the flu, voter fraud is not rampant, climate change is real, people are treated differently based on their race. Skepticism has its responsibilities. We can be truth tellers, and we can be the ones who search for truth. When we hear things, listen to what other people say about certain news sources. What is a consensus that seems to emerge? And when we find people who consistently, over and over again, are proven that they have committed to truth, then we can consider them to be a source that we trust. Look around. How do other people talk about certain sources? You're in a room with 2 doors and 2 guards, and you can ask one question. And so the question that you ask is, what would the other person say is the door to freedom? If it's the truth teller, they're going to point you towards the door to death. If it's the liar, they are going to point you towards the door to death. You go through the other one, for the truth will set you free.